every single morning, across every time zone on Earth. A massive global ritual takes place. In towering glass skyscrapers, quiet suburban kitchens, crowded subway stations, and tiny roadside stalls, billions of human beings perform the exact same action. They reach for a warm, dark liquid to wake their minds and drive away fatigue. Coffee is so deeply embedded in the rhythm of modern civilization that it feels completely natural, almost invisible. It is bought for a few coins at drive-through windows, scooped from tins on supermarket shelves, and brewed at the press of a button in millions of households. It is the designated fuel of the modern workplace, the companion of late-night study sessions, and the social backdrop for first dates and business meetings. Yet behind this ordinary morning routine lies one of the most unlikely, dangerous, and dramatic histories in human trade. Long before it became an international commodity traded on financial exchanges, coffee was a wild, obscure plant, hidden in the ancient highland rainforests of East Africa. To travel from those matted African forests to your paper cup this morning, it had to cross volatile trade routes, spark religious movements, trigger imperial bans enforced under penalty of death, power brutal colonial plantation systems, and fundamentally alter how human beings organize labor, public speech, and daily life. The harmless morning beverage in your hand is not merely a drink. It is a survivor of political subversion, economic espionage, and human struggle. To find the true origin of this global habit, we must travel back centuries into the dense, matted highlands of Kaffa in southwestern Ethiopia. Here, beneath the humid shade of the forest canopy, grew wild evergreen bushes bearing bright red cherries. Inside these cherries lay two green seeds, Coffea arabica. Long before anyone thought to roast a seed, grind it, or steep it in boiling water, indigenous communities in the region, most notably the ancestral Oromo people, recognized that this wild forest plant possessed unusual properties. When consumed, the cherries produced a noticeable surge of physical energy, sharpening perception and delaying sleep. Rather than brewing a liquid, these early communities developed practical ways to utilize the plant's natural stimulation for daily survival and travel. Workers and hunters gathered the ripe wild cherries, stripped away the pulp, and crushed the raw seeds. They mixed these crushed seeds with solid animal fat, rolling the mixture into dense, portable energy spheres. These nutrient-rich, caffeine-loaded fat balls served as vital rations for long hunting expeditions, trade journeys, and demanding physical labor through the rugged African terrain. Other times, the leaves and fruit were steeped in warm water to create a light, herbal tea. In these ancient African highlands, coffee was not a beverage of leisure, social gathering, or commerce. It was a functional, indigenous forest resource used to sustain human physical endurance. For generations, the coffee plant remained an African secret, harvested only from wild bushes in the highlands. But as trade networks expanded across the Horn of Africa, travelers, merchants, and regional traders began carrying the valuable berries across the narrow waters of the Red Sea to the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula, arriving in Yemen. It was on the mountain slopes and in the port towns of Yemen that coffee underwent its first major technological and cultural transformation. By the middle of the 15th century, brewed liquid coffee had found its first true home inside the quiet monasteries of Yemeni Sufi orders. Sufism, a mystical branch of Islam, placed great emphasis on long midnight prayer rituals, chanting, and spiritual vigils known as dhikr. Performing these nocturnal spiritual exercises required intense mental focus and prolonged wakefulness long after the rest of the city had gone to sleep. Sufi worshippers discovered that by harvesting the coffee seeds, stripping away the outer fruit, roasting the seeds over open fires until they turned dark and fragrant, and then boiling the ground-roasted seeds in water, they created a dark, potent beverage they called kahwa, a word that had previously referred to a type of dark wine. For the Sufis, kahwa was far more than a physical stimulant. It was a sacred tool for religious devotion. Drinking the warm, bitter brew in communal circles allowed monks and worshippers to overcome bodily exhaustion, clear their minds of distraction, and maintain deep spiritual concentration through hours of midnight prayer. From the Yemeni city of Mocha, knowledge of this remarkable mind-clearing drink spread rapidly northward along pilgrimage and trade routes, moving from Sufi monasteries into the great Islamic university cities of Mecca, Medina, Cairo, and Damascus. As coffee moved out of religious retreats and into secular urban life, it created an entirely new social institution that had never existed before, the public coffeehouse, known in Turkish as the café. By the 16th century, as the Ottoman Empire expanded its control over the Middle East and North Africa, coffeehouses multiplied rapidly across Cairo, Aleppo, and the imperial capital of Istanbul. These early coffeehouses were unlike any public spaces the world had seen. Traditionally, urban public gatherings occurred inside places of worship, markets, or taverns. But taverns were associated with alcohol, intoxication, and rowdy behavior, while places of worship demanded solemn religious conduct. The café offered a completely new middle ground. For the price of a cheap cup of coffee, any citizen, regardless of wealth or social standing, could enter a warm, brightly lit room, sit on carpeted benches, and spend hours drinking coffee, playing chess or backgammon, listening to musicians and storytellers, and discussing the news of the day. Crucially, because coffee produced alertness rather than intoxication, conversations inside the café were sharp, articulate, and continuous. Men gathered to read poetry, analyze religious texts, debate philosophy, and critique municipal affairs. Foreign travelers visiting Istanbul wrote back to Europe in astonishment, describing vibrant public halls where scholars, merchants, soldiers, and laborers sat side by side, engaging in lively, uninhibited intellectual debate over small clay cups of steaming black liquid. This unrestricted public speech quickly alarmed political and religious authorities. In autocratic societies, any venue where sober, alert citizens gathered to freely discuss politics, critique government policies, and exchange news was viewed with intense suspicion. Rulers recognized that coffeehouses were not merely places to drink. They were centers of information exchange and potential breeding grounds for political dissent, sedition, and anti-government plots. The first major legal crackdown occurred in Mecca in 1511. The city's governor, Khair Beg, convened a council of conservative religious scholars and legal officials to put coffee on trial, claiming that coffee was an intoxicating substance similar to alcohol, and that coffeehouses encouraged subversive political chatter and immoral behavior. Khair Beg issued a strict legal ban. Coffee stocks were seized and burned in the streets. Coffeehouses were forcibly closed, and citizens caught drinking the beverage were publicly beaten. However, when news of the ban reached the Ottoman Sultan in Cairo, who enjoyed coffee himself and recognized the revenue generated by its trade, the governor's decree was promptly overturned, and coffeehouses reopened. A far more severe wave of prohibition struck the Ottoman Empire a century later during the reign of Sultan Murad IV in the 1630s. Following severe urban riots and military mutinies in Istanbul, the young sultan determined that coffeehouses were dangerous incubators of rebellion. Murad IV issued an absolute, empire-wide ban on coffee and tobacco. Coffeehouses were demolished or boarded up, and public consumption was declared a capital offense. To enforce his decree, the sultan famously roamed the streets and alleys of Istanbul in disguise, accompanied by imperial executioners. Anyone caught selling or drinking coffee was executed on the spot, their bodies thrown into the Bosphorus. Yet despite public beatings, structural demolitions, and the constant threat of execution, state prohibition failed completely. Public demand for coffee had become too deeply ingrained in daily urban life, and the economic profits of the trade were too substantial for merchants to abandon. Citizens continued to brew coffee in secret inside private homes and hidden back rooms. Authorities soon realized that enforcing prohibition created widespread public hostility, while depriving the imperial treasury of valuable tax revenues collected on coffee imports. Within a generation of Murad IV's death, the draconian bans were abandoned. Coffeehouses reopened across the empire, and coffee secured its place as a permanent, legally protected pillar of Islamic social and commercial culture. Throughout this period of urban expansion, Yemen maintained an absolute monopoly over the global coffee supply. Virtually every bean consumed across North Africa, the Middle East, and early European trade networks came from the mountain terraces of Yemen and passed through the single port city of Mocha. Recognizing the immense economic wealth generated by their agricultural monopoly, Yemeni authorities instituted fierce export controls. No live coffee plants or fertile seeds were permitted to leave the country. Before any shipment of coffee was loaded onto foreign merchant ships in Mocha, every single bean was systematically boiled or partially roasted. This process killed the internal embryo of the seed, ensuring that while the bean remained perfect for brewing, it could never germinate if planted in foreign soil. For over a century, foreign merchants were forced to travel to Mocha, pay in silver, and buy processed coffee on Yemeni terms. Foreigners could buy the drink, but they could not buy the means to grow it. As European diplomats, travelers, and merchants encountered coffee in Ottoman cities, demand for the exotic beverage began to build in Western Europe. European trading companies, most notably the Dutch East India Company and English merchants, recognized that whoever could break Yemen's monopoly and cultivate coffee in their own colonial territories would unlock immense wealth. The first crack in Arabia's monopoly came through an act of daring agricultural espionage in the mid-17th century. Baba Budan, an Indian Sufi saint making the holy pilgrimage to Mecca, visited Yemen during his journey. Determined to bring the sacred plant home to his native India, Baba Budan managed to acquire 7 fertile, unsterilized green coffee seeds. Hiding the raw seeds against his stomach beneath his traditional garments, he successfully slipped past the guards and inspectors at the port of Mocha. Returning safely to southern India, he planted the 7 seeds in the fertile soil of the Chandragiri Hills in modern-day Karnataka. The seeds sprouted, establishing the first thriving, permanent coffee cultivation outside of Africa and Arabia, where descendants of those original plants still grow today. Decades later, Dutch traders managed to secure live coffee plants from Yemen, transporting them to the botanical gardens of Amsterdam. Realizing that the cold Dutch climate could not support commercial coffee farming, the Dutch East India Company shipped live saplings to their tropical island colony of Java in modern-day Indonesia. The volcanic soil and warm, humid climate of Java proved ideal. Within years, the Dutch established massive, highly organized coffee plantations worked by native laborers. Java became such a dominant global supplier that Java quickly became a universal slang term for coffee itself. Arabia's century-old monopoly was permanently broken, and coffee was transformed into a global colonial plantation crop. With raw coffee now arriving in European ports in large quantities, coffeehouses began spreading across major European cities, transforming European intellectual, scientific, and financial life in the late 17th century. In London, the first coffeehouse opened in 1652 in St. Michael's Alley, established by Pasqua Rosé, a Greek servant brought to England by an Ottoman trade merchant. Within decades, London was home to over 500 coffeehouses, earning the famous nickname, penny universities. For the entry price of a single penny, any man could enter a coffeehouse, receive a warm dish of coffee, read the latest printed newspapers, and engage in open debate with scientists, politicians, merchants, poets, and philosophers. Unlike European taverns, where cheap alcohol often led to intoxication and arguments, coffeehouses provided a sober environment that encouraged rational discourse, mathematical calculation, and business negotiation. Different London coffeehouses naturally specialized in specific professions and topics. Intellectuals and scientists gathered at the Grecian Coffee House, where Sir Isaac Newton and members of the Royal Society met to discuss mathematics and dissect scientific specimens. Political partisans frequented specific coffeehouses known for Whig or Tory debates. Meanwhile, merchants, ship captains, and maritime traders gathered at Edward Lloyd's coffeehouse on Tower Street to exchange news about shipping schedules, cargo losses, and ocean storms, a gathering place that eventually evolved into the world's most famous insurance market, Lloyd's of London. In a very real sense, the modern systems of international shipping, corporate insurance, scientific peer review, and daily journalism were nurtured inside the noisy, smoke-filled rooms of 17th-century coffeehouses. By the early 18th century, European demand for coffee was skyrocketing, far outstripping the supply available from Dutch Java and Arabian trade networks. European colonial powers recognized that coffee had shifted from a novel luxury into a lucrative mass-market commodity. To satisfy this booming demand, European empires expanded production across the Atlantic, establishing vast agricultural plantation systems in their Caribbean and South American colonies. This shift to Atlantic colonial plantations marked the darkest and most destructive chapter in coffee history. Coffee bushes required clearing large tracts of tropical forest, planting thousands of seedlings on steep hillsides, hand-picking delicate red cherries as they ripened, and washing, fermenting, and drying the seeds in the sun before export. To perform this relentless, back-breaking agricultural labor, European colonial powers relied entirely on the brutal system of the transatlantic slave trade. Nowhere was this colonial production engine more intensive or profitable than in the French Caribbean colony of Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti. By the 1780s, the mountain slopes of Saint-Domingue had been carved into thousands of coffee plantations, worked by hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans under agonizing, violent conditions. Enslaved laborers cleared dense jungle, carved terraced hillsides, and carried heavy sacks of harvested cherries up and down steep terrain under tropical heat. The mortality rate among enslaved workers on Saint-Domingue coffee estates was notoriously severe, with plantation owners routinely working human beings to exhaustion and importing newly enslaved Africans to replace them. Through this relentless exploitation, Saint-Domingue became the single largest coffee producer on Earth, single-handedly supplying over half of the entire world's coffee. The cheap, abundant coffee that flooded the cafes of Paris, London, and Amsterdam was directly powered by the forced labor of Saint-Domingue's enslaved population. This total reliance on forced labor meant that global coffee production was built upon a deeply unstable foundation. In August 1791, the enslaved population of Saint-Domingue rose up in a massive, meticulously coordinated rebellion, setting fire to plantation houses, processing mills, and crop fields across the island. The Haitian Revolution had begun. Through years of fierce fighting, the former slaves defeated French colonial armies, abolished slavery, and established the independent Republic of Haiti in 1804. As the plantation infrastructure of Saint-Domingue collapsed, global coffee supplies plummeted overnight, sending coffee prices soaring across European and American markets and forcing the global coffee trade to find a new center of gravity. That new center of gravity emerged in South America, inside the borders of a newly independent nation that would expand coffee production to a scale never before imagined: Brazil. Beginning in the 1820s, Brazilian landowners recognized that their vast interior highlands possessed ideal conditions for coffee cultivation. Rich, deep red soil known as terra roxa, favorable altitudes, and consistent tropical rainfall. Planters cleared immense tracts of southeastern Atlantic rainforest across the states of Rio de Janeiro, Minas Gerais, and São Paulo, planting millions of coffee bushes across vast estates called fazendas. To power this massive agricultural expansion, Brazil relied heavily on enslaved African labor, importing more enslaved human beings in the 19th century than any other country in the Americas. Even after Brazil abolished the slave trade and eventually abolished slavery itself in 1888, the coffee empire continued to expand by bringing in millions of impoverished European immigrants, primarily from Italy, Spain, and Portugal, under contractual labor systems. Brazil's coffee expansion was an agricultural revolution of industrial proportions. By the late 19th century, Brazil was producing over 80% of the entire world's coffee supply, flooding international shipping routes with cheap, abundant beans. It was Brazil's massive production capacity that permanently transformed coffee from an occasional urban luxury into a cheap, everyday staple, accessible to working-class households across North America and Europe. This explosion in Brazilian coffee production coincided directly with the peak of the Industrial Revolution in Western Europe and the United States. As industrialization accelerated, millions of people left rural agricultural lives to take jobs in rapidly growing industrial cities. Human labor was fundamentally transformed. Instead of working according to natural sunlight and seasonal weather, factory workers were organized around the rigid, artificial schedule of the clock and the steam engine. Factory labor was long, repetitive, and dangerous. Workers operated heavy, fast-moving machinery for 12, 14, or 16 hours a day inside hot, noisy industrial plants. Historically, European laborers had consumed beer, cider, or mead throughout the workday as primary beverages, since municipal water supplies were frequently unsafe. But operating dangerous industrial machinery while mildly intoxicated from alcohol led to frequent workplace accidents, dropped materials, and costly mistakes. Industrial employers quickly recognized that coffee offered the perfect solution for modern factory labor. It was warm, affordable, and safe to drink because the water was boiled during preparation. More importantly, caffeine was a pharmacological stimulant that suppressed appetite, delayed physical fatigue, and sharpened mental alertness during long, monotonous shifts. Employers began actively encouraging coffee consumption among their workforces, providing designated morning and afternoon coffee breaks and setting up warm brewing stations inside factory halls. Coffee effectively replaced alcohol as the primary beverage of the working class, becoming the official fuel of the Industrial Revolution. As urban industrial life accelerated in the early 20th century, traditional brewing methods, which required steeping ground coffee in pots of boiling water for 10 or 15 minutes, proved too slow for modern factory workers, office clerks, and commuters on brief morning breaks. In the fast-paced industrial city of Milan, Italian inventors set out to design a machine that could brew a single cup of coffee instantly upon request. In 1901, Milanese engineer Luigi Bezzera patented a heavy copper and brass machine that forced superheated water and steam under high pressure through a tightly packed puck of finely ground coffee. The high pressure extracted the rich oils and concentrated flavor of the coffee seed in just 20 to 30 seconds, producing a small, intense shot of dark liquid topped with a creamy reddish-brown foam called crema. Bezzera called his rapid extraction process espresso, meaning express or pressed out. Refined by pioneer inventors Desiderio Pavoni and later Achille Gaggia, who introduced manual lever-driven piston pumps that increased extraction pressure to unprecedented levels. The espresso machine revolutionized urban beverage service. Espresso bars spread across Italy and Western Europe, turning coffee preparation into a precise mechanical science and creating a vibrant, fast-paced café culture centered around quick, high-intensity shots of caffeine served at standing counters. While Italian engineers were perfecting high-pressure espresso extraction, military logistics during 2 world wars accelerated another breakthrough that would bring coffee into millions of modern homes: instant coffee. During World War I and World War II, military commanders faced the immense logistical challenge of supplying millions of soldiers fighting in remote trenches and battlefields with daily caffeine rations. Traditional ground coffee required heavy brewing pots, heat sources, and clean water filtration, making it impractical for soldiers under combat conditions. Food chemists and manufacturing companies developed methods to produce soluble, dehydrated coffee powder. Liquid brewed coffee was sprayed in fine mists through hot drying chambers, evaporating the water instantly and leaving behind dry concentrated coffee crystals that would dissolve immediately when mixed with warm water. During World War II, the United States military purchased nearly the entire domestic supply of instant coffee, packing millions of small instant coffee packets into military combat rations. American, British, and Allied soldiers relied on these quick caffeine packets in field trenches, troop transport ships, and combat zones across Europe and the Pacific. When millions of soldiers returned home after the war, they brought their habit of drinking quick, convenient, instant coffee with them. In the post-war decades of the 1950s and 1960s, mass-market food corporations capitalized on this consumer demand by developing pre-ground, vacuum-sealed canned coffee and instant coffee brands. Promoted through modern television advertising as convenient household essentials, canned pre-ground coffee became a standard fixture in post-war kitchens, making a hot cup of coffee the universal start to the suburban workday. By the late 20th century, however, mass industrial processing and vacuum can distribution had turned coffee into a standardized, uniform commodity. In grocery stores and diners across North America and Europe, coffee was often over-roasted, stale, and served as a thin, bitter, generic liquid. The rich cultural heritage and varied regional flavors of the coffee seed had been largely forgotten beneath decades of industrial efficiency. This setting laid the groundwork for the modern specialty coffee movement, often called the second and third waves of coffee culture. Beginning in cities like Seattle, San Francisco, and London in the late 20th century, a new generation of coffee roasters, importers, and baristas began pushing back against standardized industrial coffee. They refocused attention on the origin of the seed, highlighting single-origin crops from specific mountain regions in Ethiopia, Colombia, Guatemala, and Kenya, and perfecting light and medium roasting profiles that preserve the natural floral, fruity, and nutty notes of the Arabica cherry. This movement transformed the physical public environment once again. Modern specialty cafes spread across global cities, creating welcoming third places, social environments distinct from both the home and the workplace. Furnished with comfortable seating, warm lighting, high-pressure espresso machinery, and internet access, modern coffee shops emerged as the primary public gathering spaces of the 21st century. Here, remote workers, students, entrepreneurs, and friends gather to work, converse, and connect, unknowingly recreating the exact social atmosphere of the 17th century London penny universities and the 16th century Ottoman café. Today, when you pick up a cup of coffee in the morning, you are holding a physical convergence of global history. Inside that warm, dark liquid is the wild forest plant discovered in the Ethiopian highlands, the devotional brew of Yemeni Sufi mystics, the political subversion of Ottoman coffeehouses, the agricultural espionage of Baba Budan, the dark, complex history of Atlantic plantations, the industrial shifts of 19th century factories, the steam pressure engineering of Italian mechanics, and the modern specialty café movement. What began as an obscure, wild cherry in the forests of East Africa crossed Red Sea trade routes, broke imperial monopolies, fueled revolutions, and restructured global trade to become one of the most widely consumed substances on Earth. The next time you take a sip of your morning coffee, remember, you are not just drinking a beverage. You are participating in a global story that took centuries to build.